Hey cuties, it's Evangelina here. This is the story of Lacy, a girl whose life was tragically cut short due to the inhumane conditions in which she was kept by her closest relatives. Lacy rarely appeared in public, so we don't know much about her. Neighbors remember her as a cheerful and inquisitive child who was passionate about volleyball, loved watching Disney cartoons, and enjoyed listening to country music. She seemed like a typical girl carelessly enjoying her childhood. But everything changed when Lacy turned 9. Her family, consisting of her mother Sheila and father Clay, moved to a new house in the town of Slaughter, Louisiana. Little did they know that these walls would become a real prison for their daughter. When Lacy was supposed to enter 9th grade, her parents suddenly decided to switch her to homeschooling. Maybe they thought it would be better for their girl, but in reality, it marked the beginning of her complete isolation from the outside world. Try to imagine being confined within the 4 walls of your own house without the opportunity to interact with peers, attend school, develop, and explore the world. This is the situation young Lacy found herself in, and no one even suspected her suffering. What prompted Sheila and Clay to make such a decision? Did they realize the consequences of their actions? These questions remain unanswered to this day. But one thing can be said for sure. Their decision drastically changed Lacy's life and led to tragic events. At first glance, moving to a new house and switching to homeschooling might seem like ordinary things that shouldn't raise any suspicions. However, in Lacy's case, they became the first steps on the path to her horrific fate. Try to imagine the life of a teenager who is afraid to step outside their own house, who doesn't have the opportunity to interact with peers, make friends, and explore the world around them. For Lacy, with her diagnosis, it was a real ordeal. She found herself trapped by her own fears and limitations. But this is just the beginning of the tragedies the girl had to face. Why didn't Sheila and Clay seek professional help for their daughter? For what reason did they decide that homeschooling and complete isolation would be a way out of the situation? As the years passed, Lacy became increasingly invisible to those around her. Neighbors who had once frequently seen the girl on the street could now barely remember when they last encountered her. It seemed as if she had dissolved behind the walls of her own home, vanishing from sight. Meanwhile, her parents, Sheila and Clay, continued to live their usual lives. Sheila worked as a secretary at the court and police station, and also owned a small bakery nearby. It seemed like nothing special, just a routine job. But later, shortly before her daughter's death, Sheila got a job as an assistant prosecutor in the town of Zachary, and even became a member of the Slaughter City Council. Quite a successful career, isn't it? Lacy's father, Clay, was a respected member of the community. He represented the non-profit organization Civil War Round Table and was part of the Rotary Club. People valued him for his active community involvement and participation in the city's life. The Fletchers appeared to be an ordinary family that didn't stand out in any particular way. They occasionally attended the local church, like many other town residents. No one could have even imagined the horrors happening behind the closed doors of their house. While Lacy suffered in complete isolation, her parents continued to live their usual lives. They kept going to work, interacting with people, and participating in community affairs. Meanwhile, their daughter was slowly fading away within 4 walls, without any hope of rescue. Years had passed since Lacy was transferred to homeschooling, and the girl had practically vanished from the sight of those around her. During all this time, she was seen outside the house only once, when she was 20 years old. A random passerby noticed Lacy exercising near her parents' house. Maybe at that time, she still had a bit of freedom and strength to go out into the yard. The Fletcher's neighbor, Robert Blatz, was the last person to see Lacy alive. He recalled once talking to Clay about the girl. He inquired about how she was doing and where she had gone, as she hadn't been seen for a long time. Clay briefly replied that his daughter lived with them. She was in the house, and quickly changed the subject. At that moment, it didn't raise any suspicions for Robert. He probably knew about Lacy's social phobia and her health issues, so he didn't press further. Moreover, the Fletcher family had an impeccable reputation among the neighbors. They were respected members of the community, and nothing indicated any possible trouble. Lacy had practically vanished from the life of the community, and it didn't concern anyone. The girl who had once played on the street and interacted with neighbors suddenly became invisible, and everyone accepted it as a given. One can only imagine the despair and loneliness Lacy experienced during all those years. She was imprisoned not only physically within the walls of her own house, but also emotionally in the indifference and blindness of those around her. January 3, 2022, forever changed the lives of the Fletcher family and shook the entire local community. That day, Sheila called the police with a report that was hard to comprehend. Her 36-year-old daughter Lacy had stopped breathing. How could this have happened? What had been going on in this house all these years while Lacy was isolated from the world? Rumors immediately began to circulate around this incident. Some claimed that Sheila dared to call the police only because someone from outside was in their house at that moment. Allegedly, the very fact of someone's presence from the outside forced her to act. Otherwise, she would have continued to remain silent. One of the Fletcher's neighbors, who claimed to be in their house on that fateful day, noted that Sheila would hardly have called the police if not for his presence. This leads one to wonder whether it was an attempt by the mother to conceal the traces of her terrible neglect and indifference. What really happened on that January day? I'm afraid we will never know all the details. The only thing known for certain is that Lacy was found dead in her own bed, in a house that should have been a cozy shelter for her, but instead became a place of suffering and death. The following days and weeks were filled with investigations, interrogations, and examinations. Local residents whispered and shared speculations, trying to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet community. Lacy's death marked the beginning of a long and painful process of seeking truth and justice. What law enforcement officers and medical workers saw in the Fletcher's house that January day will forever remain etched in their memory. In the living room on the couch, they discovered the body of 36-year-old Lacey Ellen Fletcher, who had spent the last 12 years of her life there. The scene that opened before their eyes was horrifying. Lacy's body was disfigured by pressure sores, which had likely formed due to prolonged contact with the surface of the couch. Her skin was covered in ulcers and her own excrement, indicating a complete absence of basic hygiene and care. The most shocking aspect was that the girl's body was infested with insect larvae and mouse droppings. This indicated that she had literally rotted alive in that spot, without any help or intervention. Medical experts who examined Lacy's body noticed that she had actually grown into the couch. It is quite possible that the girl had not gotten up from it for so long that her muscles had atrophied, and her skin had fused with the surface of the furniture. Lacy's legs were bent under her body in an unnatural position, indicating her prolonged immobility. At the time of her death, Lacy was wearing only a dirty, tattered t-shirt. She weighed a mere 43 kilograms 95 pounds, which was catastrophically low for an adult woman of her height. Most likely, the girl suffered from severe malnutrition and dehydration, which led to her death. Some sources also reported that the autopsy results revealed the presence of coronavirus in Lacy's body. This was surprising because, according to the testimonies of neighbors and relatives, the only people the girl had contact with in recent years were her own parents. The question arose, could they have been the ones to infect their daughter during the pandemic? When police officers began investigating the circumstances of Lacey Fletcher's death, one of the key questions was, what had caused her demise? The answer they received from medical experts was shocking. According to the coroner, Dr. Ivel Hasbrock Mims, Lacy had fallen victim to serious medical neglect by her caregivers, her own parents. For years, they had disregarded their daughter's basic needs, leading to a whole range of health problems. Due to chronic malnutrition and acute starvation, Lacy's body was depleted, deprived of vital nutrients. Her muscles had atrophied due to prolonged immobility, resulting in the formation of pressure sores and ulcers on her body. But the most terrifying aspect was that at some point, Lacy developed osteomyelitis, an infectious inflammation of the bone tissue. The pathogens had likely entered her body through open wounds and ulcers. Without proper treatment, the infection spread throughout her body, causing sepsis, a life-threatening reaction of the body to inflammation. Law enforcement also investigated information that Lacy might have suffered from locked-in syndrome, also known as pseudocoma. According to some reports, the girl seemed to be in a state of paralysis, unable to move or speak, although her consciousness was alert. But Dr. Hasbrock Mims refuted these assumptions, noting that apart from the previously diagnosed autism and social phobia, no other neurological disorders were detected in Lacy. A striking fact is that Lacy's last documented visit to a doctor occurred when she was only 16 years old. Just imagine, 20 years without proper medical supervision, without basic checkups and tests. During this time, any disease could have developed and led to fatal consequences. In May 2022, after a thorough investigation into the circumstances of Lacey Fletcher's death, her parents, Sheila and Clay, were formally charged with second-degree murder. This was the first step towards justice for the girl who had suffered in silence for so many years. Despite the severity of the crime, they spent only 36 hours behind bars. Imagine, accused of their own daughter's death, they were released on bail of $300,000 each. This amount may seem astronomical to the average person, but for a couple who held quite high positions in the local community, it wasn't that much. Of course, releasing suspects on bail is a common practice in our justice system. But in this case, it was hard to accept the fact that people who had brought their own daughter to such a horrible state could calmly await trial in the comfort of their own home. However, even the highest bail could not soften the shock and outrage that gripped the jurors when they were shown footage from the crime scene and photographs of Lacy's body during the court session. Imagine people's reactions to these chilling images. Some couldn't hold back tears, while others turned away, unable to look at the screen. Even experienced lawyers and law enforcement officers, who had seen plenty of brutality in their practice, were stunned by the extent of suffering Lacy had endured. This evidence became irrefutable proof of the inhumane conditions in which the girl had lived the last years of her life. The jurors saw with their own eyes the pressure sores and ulcers on her body, the insects and rodents that had infested her bed, the filth and neglect of the room where she had spent her final days. During interrogations, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction and negligence in caring for their daughter. They told investigators that Lacy suffered from autism and an extremely severe form of social phobia, which only worsened over the years. According to their account, the girl was terrified of leaving the confines of the house and avoided any contact with the outside world. Allegedly, this was why she stayed in her room around the clock, refusing even to get up from the couch. The Fletchers claimed that the crisis in Lacy's condition occurred when she was a little over 20. The girl had supposedly completely withdrawn, isolating herself, losing any desire for communication and activity. She would allegedly scream and throw tantrums when someone tried to persuade her to leave her comfort zone. Clay and Sheila insisted that they had made attempts to help their daughter. They claimed to have tried to lift her from the couch, force her to move, but it only worsened the situation. Lacy would allegedly fall into such severe stress and aggression that the parents were simply afraid to change anything. Particularly cynical were Sheila's words about how Lacy never complained about the pressure sores and wounds that festered on her emaciated body. The mother claimed that she regularly examined and treated these ulcers, but the girl allegedly didn't want to be bothered. Throughout the investigation and trial, Sheila and Clay Fletcher tried to justify their inaction by claiming that Lacy was an adult and therefore had the right to make her own decisions about her life. They argued that the girl had consciously chosen to remain confined to the couch, refusing any activity or assistance. According to the parents' version, they simply accepted their daughter's choice and allowed her to exist in this way. The Fletchers insisted that Lacy had retained mental clarity and the ability to communicate until her last day, which meant she could have changed her situation if she had wanted to. But these statements raised serious doubts for me as an investigator. After all, the condition in which Lacy's body was found clearly indicated that the girl had been dying in bed for more than one day, surrounded by filth, parasites, and her own waste. This couldn't have happened suddenly, over a single weekend. The parents were well aware of their daughter's vulnerable mental state, but had not taken any measures for years to provide her with proper care and treatment. They had every opportunity to take Lacy to a doctor, turn to the appropriate services, arrange for hospitalization, or at least hire a caregiver. Instead, they simply left the helpless woman to fend for herself, dooming her to a slow and painful death. And even when the couple allegedly went on vacation, leaving their mentally ill daughter alone in such a pitiful state, it already amounted to criminal negligence. They should have been aware of the risks and responsibilities they carried as guardians of an incapacitated person. The defense tried to touch the jurors with the image of parents supposedly grieving for their prematurely deceased daughter. They hoped that the respected status of the family and the Fletchers' active community involvement would play in their favor. But the prosecution understood that a cruel truth was hidden behind the mask of respectability, and our task was to bring this truth to the court and secure a just punishment. The prosecutor insisted on a thorough investigation of all the circumstances of the case and the appropriate classification of the Fletchers' crime. In my opinion, their actions fell under the article of second-degree murder and should be punished with life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And so, after months of investigation, dozens of witness interrogations, examinations, and fierce court battles, we finally reached the denouement of this chilling story. The jury, having heard all the evidence and arguments of the parties, found Sheila and Clay Fletcher guilty of murdering their daughter Lacy through criminal negligence and inhumane treatment. Witnesses remember the tense silence that fell over the courtroom when the presiding judge announced the verdict. It seemed as if the whole world had frozen in anticipation, and when the words, "life imprisonment without the possibility of parole," were uttered, one could hear dozens of people sighing with relief in that silence. Justice had finally prevailed, but the joy of victory was overshadowed by the realization of the full tragedy of the situation. Lacy, an innocent, defenseless girl who suffered from severe illnesses, had become a victim of the cruelty and selfishness of those who should have surrounded her with love and care. She died in agony, in complete loneliness, not understanding why such a fate had befallen her. During the announcement of the verdict, a heavy atmosphere filled with grief reigned in the courtroom. People were not ashamed of their tears, not hiding their shock and indignation. The journalists present seemed to not seek sensational headlines for the first time in many years. They simply silently honored Lacy's memory. Thanks to this tragedy, serious discussions began at the state level about guardianship of incapacitated individuals, the accessibility of medical and social assistance, and monitoring the observance of the rights of vulnerable population groups. And although there is still much work ahead, we have moved from a dead end and taken the first steps towards a more humane and responsible society. I know that the memory of Lacy will live on in the hearts of all who empathized with this tragic story. Thank you, cuties. Take care.